"No one will dance with you tonight," Clara Vale said, and she did not bother to lower her voice. She stood beside Helen at the edge of Lord Ashford's ballroom, her fan moving slowly, her smile perfectly arranged. The music had just begun, a bright, swelling waltz that filled the long gilded room and sent couples turning across the floor in pairs. Around them, candles burned in every sconce. Crystal caught the light, silk gowns moved like water, the whole room was alive, and Clara's voice cut through it as cleanly as a blade. Rose laughed. It was a softer sound than Clara's words, quieter and somehow crueler for it, because Rose knew exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. Helen did not answer. She stood with her gloved hands folded at her waist, her chin level, her eyes fixed on the far end of the room where the musicians played. She had learned long ago that answering Clara in public solved nothing. A protest became a scene became a story, and the story was always told by Clara. So Helen stood still and watched the ballroom move without her. A gentleman crossed the floor and bowed before Clara. Clara accepted with a gracious smile, as if this were the natural order of things, which, in the Vale family, it was. A second gentleman appeared moments later, and Rose took his arm with a small, pleased laugh. Helen watched them both step onto the floor. She watched the space around her grow quiet while the rest of the room grew louder. She watched gentlemen glance her way and then look past her. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. What she did not know, could not have known in that moment, was that across the ballroom, past the slow turning of a dozen couples, past the rows of watching mothers and the clusters of whispering guests, a pair of dark, steady eyes had settled on the three Vale sisters. They had watched Clara deliver her line. They had watched Rose laugh. They had watched Helen go still, and the man those eyes belonged to had heard enough to understand that something cruel was happening at the edge of this beautiful room. He had not acted yet, he simply watched. His name was Henry Grey, the Duke of Blackmoor, and he was not a man who moved without purpose, but he was watching. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you were Helen in that ballroom, standing at the wall while your own sisters laughed at you in front of everyone, what would you have done? Would you have walked away with your head high? Would you have answered Clara, even knowing it would make a scene? Or would you have stayed and waited, the way Helen did, to see if one person in that room would finally look her way and see the truth? Tell me in the comments. And while you are there, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I love knowing where these stories find you. If this is your first time here, please drop a like on this video. It truly helps more than you know. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and follow for more. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber keeps these stories coming. All right, thank you. Now let us get back to the story. The waltz did not stop for Helen Vale. That was the thing about humiliation in a ballroom. The music kept playing, the candles kept burning, couples kept turning in their slow, practiced circles across the polished floor, and the world continued its business as though nothing of any consequence had just occurred near the east wall, where Clara Vale had told her sister, in a clear and carrying voice, that no one would dance with her tonight. Helen had not moved. She stood where she had been standing since their mother arranged them. At the edge of the floor, 30 minutes ago, her ivory gloves folded at her waist, her back straight, her face composed into the expression she had spent years perfecting. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that lived just below a smile, the controlled arrangement of features that said nothing is wrong here, nothing is happening, I am perfectly well. She had worn that expression at breakfast tables, and in drawing rooms, and in the back of carriages for most of her 22 years she wore it now. Clara stood to her left, fan moving in slow, elegant arcs. She was beautiful tonight in a way that the room had already noticed and agreed upon. Her gown was the particular shade of deep rose that their mother had selected 3 weeks ago and paid for on credit. Helen was not supposed to know about. Her hair was dressed by the lady's maid, who came upstairs first each morning. Her dance card had been half full before the first set was announced. She had delivered her line without looking at Helen directly. That was Clara's method. She spoke to the room, or to Rose, or to no one in particular, and the words simply landed where they landed. Rose stood to Helen's right, and Rose laughed. It was the laugh that did the real damage. Clara's cruelty had a kind of grandness to it, a confidence that at least required effort. Rose's laugh was something smaller and worse. It was the laugh of someone who had not thought of the cruelty herself, but was glad someone else had. The laugh that said, "I agree. I have always agreed, and I am relieved to be on the correct side of this." Rose was 18. She still had time to become a different kind of person. Helen was not certain she would take it. Around them the ballroom continued. A couple swept past close enough that the hem of the woman's gown almost touched Helen's feet. The woman did not notice. Her partner was saying something into her ear, and she was laughing, bright and unself-conscious, the laugh of someone who had not spent the last 5 minutes being arranged and dismissed by her own blood. Helen breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She did not answer Clara. She did not look at Rose. She watched the floor and kept her hands still and decided, as she had decided many times before, that composure was the only thing in this room that belonged entirely to her.
The second set was announced, and the gentlemen moved. Helen watched them the way you watch weather when you are standing outside without a coat. Not with hope exactly, with attention. There was Lord Pembridge, young and agreeable, who crossed the floor toward Clara before the master of ceremonies had finished speaking. There was Mr. Aldworth, broad-shouldered, and recently returned from the continent, who made his way to Rose with the slightly urgent energy of a man who had noticed her from across the room and decided to act before anyone else did. There was Mr. Doyle, who was neither young nor particularly agreeable, but who had decent prospects and a mother who attended every ball in the season, and he stopped before Clara, too, realized his error when he saw Pembridge already at her side, and redirected himself toward a Miss Cavendish who stood 3 feet away. No one redirected himself toward Helen. She watched her dance card. It was a small, cream-colored thing tied to her wrist with a white ribbon, and it had one name on it, written in the tentative hand of young Mr. Farley, who was 17 and the nephew of Lady Ashford's housekeeper, and had asked Helen to dance in the first set with the desperate good manners of a boy who had been instructed by someone to be kind to the quieter guests. He had danced with her correctly, thanked her with genuine if transparent relief, and had not approached her since. The rest of the card was blank. Clara's was nearly full. Rose's had 3 names already, and the night was not yet an hour old. Helen straightened the ribbon on her wrist and looked at the card for a moment, longer than she needed to. Then she looked up and across the room at nothing in particular. Her mother appeared at her shoulder. Lady Nora Vale was a woman who moved through ballrooms the way a general moves through difficult terrain, with calculation and without sentiment. She was dressed in charcoal silk, which was an economical choice that she wore as if it were not. She touched Helen's elbow, and her fingers were not gentle. "Stand straighter," Lady Nora said quietly. "You are rounding your shoulders." Helen straightened. "And do not look at the floor." A woman who watches the floor looks as though she expects to find something lost there. "Yes, Mother. Clara has 3 prospects this evening." 3. I will not have your manner draw attention away from what matters tonight. Lady Nora's eyes moved across the room as she spoke, cataloguing, assessing, never settling. Be pleasant, be unobtrusive, and for the love of all that is decent, Do not attach yourself to any conversation that does not require your presence. She was gone before Helen could respond, not that a response had been invited. Helen stood where she was told to stand and understood something she had perhaps always known, but had tried, with the persistent optimism of someone who has not yet accepted a verdict, to leave unconfirmed. Her mother was not going to protect her, not from Clara's words, not from Rose's laughter, not from the blank lines on her dance card or the way the room moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been placed there by mistake. She was on her own in this ballroom. She had been on her own in this family for longer than that. The waltz began again. Helen folded her hands and watched. Henry Grey arrived late, which was his habit and his right. He entered through the main doors of the ballroom at 9:15, when the first sets had already concluded, and the room had arranged itself into its familiar social topography. The mothers along the walls, the young ladies near the floor, the gentlemen in clusters near the card-room door. Lord James Hart arrived beside him, as James always did, with the easy confidence of a man who enjoys company and has never been made to feel that his presence is unwelcome anywhere. "The Ashford ball," James said pleasantly, surveying the room. "Candlelit, well attended, and already half convinced it is the event of the season." "It is the third event of the season," Henry said. "Yes, but it has the best aspect." Henry did not respond to this. He moved into the room at a pace that did not invite interception, which was a skill he had developed over many years of being intercepted. He was tall enough that people saw him before he saw them, which meant the interceptions generally began from a distance. A mother near the entrance redirected her daughter toward his path with the subtle efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. A young woman he did not recognize smiled at him with a brightness that suggested the smile had been prepared in advance. He acknowledged both with the minimal courtesy that discharged the social obligation without encouraging continuation. He had not come to this ballroom to be managed. He had come because Lord Ashford was an old friend of his father's, and because declining 3 consecutive invitations would have been read as a statement. Henry had no wish to make statements tonight. James fell into step beside him as they moved along the edge of the floor. "The Vale sisters are here. Lady Nora has had them positioned near the east wall since 8. Clara is already drawing attention as expected." Henry said nothing. "Rose is charming in the way of someone who has studied charm rather than felt it. And the third one, the middle daughter, I cannot recall being introduced." Henry had noticed the east wall before James mentioned it. He had noticed it because there was a quality to the stillness at that end of the room that was different from the ordinary stillness of the wallflower arrangements. It was not the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of someone who had made a decision not to show what they were feeling and was working very hard to maintain it. He had seen Clara Vale deliver her line. He had not heard the words precisely, but he had seen the angle of her body, the movement of her fan, the way the sound traveled, and he had seen the youngest sister laugh. He had seen the middle daughter go still and stay still, and look at the floor for one unguarded moment before raising her chin again. He had noted it the way he noted things that did not add up. He said nothing to James. He accepted a glass from a passing footman, moved to a position that gave him a clearer view of the room, and watched. He was not the kind of man who acted on incomplete information. Mrs. May Reed was 71 years old, a widow of 6 years, and possessed of the particular dignity that comes from a long life during which one has outlasted most of the people who underestimated you. She had been seated near the east wall by a well-meaning niece, who had since drifted toward the refreshment table and not returned. And she had been sitting with the careful composure of a woman who will not ask for help and will not admit she needs it. Her ivory-handled cane rested against the chair beside her. At some point during the second set, as the couples near her moved into the opening figure, Someone's sleeve or skirt or careless elbow caught the cane. It clattered to the floor. Mrs. Reed looked at it. She made the calculation that retrieving it herself would require an undignified amount of effort. She looked around with the quietly measuring expression of someone deciding whether to ask. Helen was moving, before she had made a conscious decision to move. She stepped away from her place at the wall, crossed the short distance to Mrs. Reed's chair, and bent to retrieve the cane with the efficient ease of someone who is not performing a kindness, but simply performing it. She set it upright and offered it to the older woman with her free hand. "Thank you, my dear," Mrs. Reed said, and she looked at Helen the way older women sometimes look at young ones who have done something quietly correct, directly, and with attention. "Of course," Helen said. "Are you comfortable? Shall I find your niece?" "My niece," Mrs. Reed said pleasantly, "has discovered that the Ashford aspic is remarkably compelling. I shall survive the abandonment." "But you are kind to ask." Helen smiled. It was not the controlled arrangement of features she had been wearing all evening. It was a real smile, small and quick, the kind that surfaces without permission. She was straightening, preparing to return to her place, when she heard Clara's voice behind her, addressed to Rose and calibrated to Carrie. "There," Clara said. "She has found her level for the evening." Rose laughed, again the same laugh. Helen kept walking. She did not turn. She resumed her position at the wall and refolded her hands and put her face back into its arrangement. She did not look in her sister's direction. She did not see what Clara and Rose did not see. Henry Grey, standing 40 feet away at the edge of the floor with a glass of wine he had not drunk, had watched the entire sequence. He had watched Helen move without hesitation when the cane fell. He had watched the exchange with Mrs. Reed. He had watched her smile. He had heard, if not the words, then the shape of what Clara said, and he had watched Helen's back go straight and her pace stay even. He set his glass on the nearest surface. Lord James appeared at his elbow. "You are watching the middle daughter." Henry said nothing. "That is the second time in 20 minutes, James observed, with the tone of a man who has noted something and is deciding how interested he is. Henry turned away from the east wall. "She is the only person in this room who has done anything that was not required of her." Lady Nora found Helen between sets. She did not announce her arrival. She simply materialized at Helen's side with the silent precision of a woman who has learned to move through social spaces without creating disturbance, because disturbance, in Lady Nora's understanding of the world, was what happened when the wrong kind of attention landed on the wrong kind of person. She did not look at Helen. She looked at the room. "You were seen," Lady Nora said. "Mrs. Reed dropped her cane," Helen said. "I am aware of what happened. I am telling you how it appeared." Helen was quiet. A young woman darting across a ballroom floor to retrieve an elderly woman's cane is a young woman who has made herself conspicuous in a manner that serves no purpose. It draws the sort of attention that follows you home. "She needed help," Helen said. "Everyone needs help," Lady Nora replied, with the brisk patience of someone dispatching an argument that should not have been made. That is not a reason to provide it publicly. Helen looked at her mother's profile. She had studied that profile for as long as she could remember. She knew its architecture, the way you know a landscape you have grown up inside, the particular angle of the jaw, the set of the mouth, the way certain emotions moved across it so quickly and so quietly that if you blinked, you missed them entirely. "Clara must make a match tonight," Lady Nora continued. "Not must in the social sense, must in the actual sense. You understand me." Helen understood her. She understood that Mr. Finch had visited the house twice in the last fortnight and had left both times without staying for tea. She understood that her father's estate, such as it was, had been managed with an optimism that had not aged well. She understood that the rose gown had been paid for on credit, and that the credit had a limit, and that limit was somewhere behind them now. She understood that she was in her mother's calculations, a variable that needed to resolve in Clara's favor. "I will not embarrass the family," Helen said. "You will do more than that," Lady Nora said, still watching the room. "You will be invisible. That is what tonight requires of you. Not charm, not assistance, not drawing the eye of anyone whose eye should be on Clara." A pause. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Helen said. Lady Nora moved away. Helen stood in her assigned place and understood, with a clarity she had not allowed herself before tonight, that her mother did not want her diminished. Diminishment implies something that once existed. Her mother wanted her absent. She wanted the space at the wall where Helen was standing to contain a girl with Helen's face, who did not take up any of the rooms available. Attention. She wanted Helen to disappear while still being present enough to be useful. Helen looked at her blank dance card. She had been disappearing for years. She was very good at it. She had not known, until this moment, how furious that made her. Clara had noticed Henry Grey at 9:15, which was approximately 4 minutes after he entered the room, and 6 minutes before she positioned herself. This was not accident. Clara operated with the social precision of a woman who had been told since childhood that she was beautiful, which had the practical effect of making her very good at reading rooms, because rooms were what she moved through, and she had studied their mechanics the way a navigator studies maps. She knew which guests had arrived, which names carried weight, and which directions a person of consequence was likely to move before they moved there. Henry Grey was the most consequential person in this room. He was also unmistakably avoiding everyone who was attempting to introduce themselves, which Clara correctly identified not as inaccessibility, but as preference. He did not want to be approached. He wanted to encounter. She positioned herself accordingly. She moved to the edge of the floor, near the musician's end, where the natural circulation of the room created a drift of guests moving right to left, which would carry Henry in her direction if he continued on his current path. She arranged herself in conversation with Lady Featherington's eldest daughter, which was purely functional, as the girl had a pleasant face and would provide an appealing social context, and she waited. Henry Grey did not take the drift. He altered his course with the unhurried ease of someone who had not noticed the positioning, or had noticed it and was choosing a different direction. And it was impossible from the outside to tell which it was, which was somehow worse than either. Clara's fan did not pause. Her expression did not change. She concluded her conversation with Lady Featherington's daughter, made a small pleasantry about the music, and moved to a second position near the refreshment table. Rose appeared at her elbow. He went toward the windows. "I can see that. Do you want me to?" "No," Clara said crisply. "I want you to go and stand where you were standing, and look as though we have not been watching." Rose retreated. Clara took a glass of lemonade she did not want, and stood at the refreshment table and looked pleasantly at the middle distance, and thought with a sharpening attention about the fact that Henry Grey had now changed direction twice in 20 minutes without dancing with anyone, without being drawn into any conversation, and without doing what men of his standing at this sort of ball almost always eventually did, which was allow themselves to be positioned. He was looking at something. She turned, with the unhurried precision of someone who has no particular reason to turn, and followed the direction of his gaze. She found it. A slow, cold thing moved through Clara's chest. She recognized it. She had felt it before, though not in a long time, and never in connection with Helen. It felt like threat. There are things about Helen Vale that the ballroom did not know and would not have thought to ask. It did not know that the ivory gloves on her hands had been mended at the left wrist, so carefully and with such small stitches that the repair was invisible unless you were looking for it, which no one in this room was. Helen had done the mending herself at the small writing desk in the back bedroom she occupied on the second floor of the Vale house, on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks before the ball. by the light of a single candle. It did not know that the letter from Mr. Finch, the family steward, which Lady Nora had received and read and placed face down on the parlor table last Thursday, had been summarized, managed, and drafted into a reply, not by Lady Nora, but by Helen, who had taken the letter from the table after her mother left the room and had spent 2 hours producing a response that bought the family another 30 days, without requiring Lady Nora to confront numbers she did not wish to confront. It did not know that 3 days before this ball, Clara had appeared in Helen's doorway at 10:30 in the morning with a torn seam in her rose gown, and had not asked Helen to mend it so much as placed it on the chair beside the door and left, and that Helen had mended it because the alternative was a scene about the gown that would take an hour and achieve nothing. The ballroom did not know these things. The ballroom saw a young woman of middling looks and unremarkable dress standing at the east wall without a dance partner, and the story it told itself about that young woman was a simple one. Helen had grown up inside that simple story. She had watched it be told about her at enough breakfast tables and enough social functions that she had ceased some years ago to be surprised by it. What surprised her, and had always surprised her, was not that people believed it. It was how much work it took to be invisible. How exhausting it was to make yourself small enough that no one was inconvenienced by your existence, to be present enough to be useful and absent enough to be unthreatening, to mend and manage and absorb, and never, under any circumstances, require anything in return. She had been doing it so long that she had almost stopped noticing the effort. Almost. Tonight, standing at the wall with her blank dance card and her mended gloves, and the sound of her sister's laughter still somewhere at the back of her mind, she noticed it very clearly. She was tired, not the tired of a late evening or a long journey, the tired of someone who has been asked to carry something heavy for so long that she has forgotten there was a time before the carrying. She was tired, and she was furious, and neither thing showed on her face. She had been revising this decision for the last 40 minutes. She would stay until the second set, then the third. She told herself she was being sensible, that leaving early would be noticed, that Lady Nora would have something to say about it on the carriage ride home. But she knew, if she was honest with herself, that the real reason she stayed was smaller and more stubborn than practicality. It was the same reason she had stood straight all evening and kept her hands folded and not cried. She was not going to be driven from this room, not by Clara's voice, not by Rose's laugh, not by a dance card that said no one here has chosen you. She would leave when she chose to leave. That was the only thing tonight she could control, and she intended to keep it. She found a position slightly removed from her sister's, near the second column from the east wall, where the candlelight was softer and the view of the floor was unobstructed. She watched the couples assemble. She watched the musicians settle into their opening bars. Across the ballroom, Clara laughed. It was a social laugh, the bright, deliberate kind deployed for an audience, and it carried the way Clara's sounds always carried, as though the room had been designed with her acoustics in mind. Helen did not turn toward it. She had made a decision not to turn toward it, but someone else did, Henry Grey. Standing near the windows on the far side of the room, with a glass he had been holding for 20 minutes without drinking from it, turned his head at the sound of Clara's laugh. He did not turn toward Clara. He turned in the direction the sound had come from, and then his gaze moved with the quiet deliberateness of a man following a thread along the east wall. It found Helen. She did not know he was looking. She was watching the floor, where the third set was beginning. And she had that expression again, the one that was not quite a smile, and not quite anything. The one that said, "I am perfectly well, and nothing is happening here." But her hands, folded at her waist, were folded more tightly than before, and she was not watching the dancing the way a person watches something that interests them. She was watching it the way a person watches something that is happening without them. Henry Grey set down his glass. He did not move. Not yet. He looked at her for a long moment, with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has decided something without quite naming the decision. And then he looked away, back toward the room, back toward the noise and the movement and the business of a London ball in full progress. But he knew where she was now. And at the edge of the floor, near the second column, Helen Vale turned slightly away from the light and began, quietly, to make herself ready to leave. Annabelle was 17 years old and very good at being unnoticed. This was a professional skill. In a house like the Ashford townhouse, on a night like this one, the best servants were the ones the guests looked through rather than at, the ones whose hands appeared and withdrew without interrupting the flow of conversation, whose footsteps did not register, whose presence solved problems before the problems became visible. Anna had been working since she was 14, and she understood the mechanics of invisibility the way Helen understood composure from the inside with effort. She had been stationed near the east wall to manage wraps and small items that guests set down and forgot, and she had been doing her work well, and she had seen what happened. She had seen Rose Vale move to the narrow console table against the wall, the one with the arrangement of winter greenery in a silver vase. During the brief interval between the second and third sets, when the room rearranged itself and no one was watching any particular corner of it with attention, she had seen Rose lift Helen's dance card, which Helen had set on the table's edge while adjusting her glove, and she had seen Rose, with a quick and practiced motion, slide it behind the vase. She had seen Clara, standing 3 feet away with her back to the table, smile. Anna stood very still, with a folded wrap over her arm, and decided, in the rapid and unpleasant way that servants are sometimes forced to decide things, what she was going to do with what she had just seen. Helen returned to the table a moment later and touched the surface where her card had been. Her hand moved in a small, searching arc. She looked at the table. She looked at the floor around it. She looked briefly at Clara and Rose, who were discussing something together with the unhurried ease of two people who have nothing on their consciences. Clara glanced at Helen's search and said nothing. She smiled, the small private smile of a woman who has moved a chess piece and is watching the board adjust. Helen looked at Anna. Anna looked back at her. Just for a moment. The kind of look that carried information without words, because words were not available to Anna in this situation, not without consequences she could not afford. Helen held her gaze for 1 second and understood. She did not demand the card. She did not confront her sisters. She straightened, set her hands at her waist, and looked out at the ballroom floor with the expression that said nothing is wrong here, and everything inside her went very quiet and very cold. The card was gone. Whatever slim possibility it had represented was behind a vase, and she could not prove a thing. The message reached Lady Nora just before the third set ended. It came through the Ashford House steward, relayed from a footman, delivered in the form of a small folded note that Lady Nora received with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to managing bad news in public. She read it once. She folded it along its original crease. She placed it in the small bag at her wrist and stood very still for a moment in the way that the Vale children had learned to recognize as the stillness before a decision. Helen was standing 6 feet away, and she saw all of this because she had spent a lifetime reading her mother from a distance. She saw the note. She saw the stillness. She saw the particular set of Lady Nora's jaw that meant the news had been financial, and it had not been good Mr. Finch. It had to be Mr. Finch. There was no one else who sent notes to ballrooms. Lady Nora crossed to Helen with a speed that did not look like urgency but was. "I need you to pay attention tonight," she said, low and direct. "I have been paying attention," Helen said. "Not to the room, to Clara." Lady Nora's eyes moved to where Clara stood across the floor. radiant and laughing at something Lord Pembridge had said. She is close tonight. Pembridge is attentive. The Duke is in the room. If either of them moves in her direction with intent, I need you to ensure that nothing interrupts it. Helen looked at her mother. What would interrupt it? You, Lady Nora said, without particular cruelty, simply as a fact. Your presence in the wrong place. Your manner drawing a question. Anything that causes a gentleman's attention to wander from Clara and land somewhere it does not need to land. She paused. I received a letter this afternoon that I did not share with you. Mr. Finch is being pressed. We have until the end of the month. After that, the options become unpleasant. There it was, the shape of it, clear and cold as river water in January. So tonight matters, Helen said. Clara's match matters, Lady Nora said. Which is not the same thing, but which is what we have. Helen understood the transaction being offered. She understood that she was being asked to spend the rest of this evening, ensuring that Clara shone without interference, which meant not helping elderly women who dropped their canes, not existing in any corner of the room that a gentleman's eye might travel through on its way to Clara, not being anything that occupied space. She understood that her mother was not asking her to do this out of calculation. She was asking her to do it out of fear, which was almost worse because fear she understood, and it was harder to be furious at someone you understood. Yes, Helen said, I understand. Lady Nora gave her one look, brief and exhausted, and not without something that in a different woman might have been guilt. And then she turned away to resume her position along the wall, and Helen turned back to the room, and the distance between them was, as it had always been, wider than the feet between them suggested. Lord Victor Hale had the face of a man designed by committee to appear trustworthy. He was 34, well-dressed in the way of someone who considers dressing well a component of social armor rather than personal pleasure, and he had the particular social skill of making every conversation feel like a confidence, as though he, and whoever he was speaking to, had arrived at a private understanding that excluded the rest of the room. Women found him charming. Men found him useful. Both were correct, and both were also, if they had examined the feeling carefully, slightly uncomfortable without knowing why. He had arrived at the Ashford ball at 9:30 and spent 40 minutes establishing himself in the card room before emerging to survey the ballroom with the unhurried air of a man who has already secured his position and is now attending to secondary interests. His primary interest was Clara Vale. His secondary interest was ensuring that nothing complicated that interest. He found Helen first. She was standing near the second column, slightly separated from her sisters, and she had the stillness of someone who is managing something internally and doing it alone. Victor crossed to her with the relaxed pace of a man making a social courtesy call. Miss Vale, he said pleasantly, you look very well this evening. Helen looked at him with the direct, measuring attention that people like Victor tended to find slightly disconcerting in quiet women. Lord Victor, she said, I have not seen you on the floor this evening. No, a shame. He said it the way you say something you do not mean, but have decided to include for structural purposes. His eyes moved across the room to where Clara stood. Your sister dances beautifully. She does, Helen agreed. You have always been the more studious of the family, I think, Victor said, returning his gaze to Helen with the pleasant, measured attention of a man describing something he considers a limitation rather than a quality. Very useful in a household, I am certain. Very quietly useful. It was delivered perfectly. Polite enough that objecting to it required more social aggression than Helen was positioned to deploy without consequence, and cruel enough that she was meant to feel it precisely. She looked at him. A woman of your particular situation, Victor continued, his voice dropping into something low and almost kind, the tone of a confidential warning, might find that drawing attention to herself above her natural station creates difficulties. especially on a night when her family has other priorities. Helen kept her expression even. She kept her breathing regular. She felt the specific cold of a threat that has dressed itself as advice. "I appreciate the thought," she said, in a tone that was perfectly courteous and meant nothing of the sort. Victor studied her for a moment. He was deciding, she could see it, whether she was going to be a problem. Then he smiled, the full social smile, the one that reached his eyes because he had practiced it until it did, and inclined his head and moved away toward Clara. Helen watched him go and understood that she had just been warned. She also understood that the warning meant something had changed tonight, or was changing, and that whatever Victor feared she might disrupt was significant enough to merit the preemptive pressure. She looked across the ballroom. Henry Grey was still near the windows. He was not looking at her. He was in conversation with Lord James, his attention on something James was saying. But the fact of him, his presence in this room, suddenly occupied a different quality of space in Helen's mind. She did not know what that meant. She only knew that Victor had noticed it before she had. James Hart had many qualities that Henry valued, and the most practical of them was this: he paid attention to things that other people decided were beneath attention, and he was honest about what he found there. "Tell me about the Vale family," Henry said. They were standing slightly apart from the nearest group, in the way that Henry preferred, close enough to the room to observe it, and far enough from it to speak without being overheard. James had a glass of something, and was using it as a prop rather than drinking it, which was his own version of Henry's untouched wine. "The Vales," said, without particular surprise. He had long ago stopped being surprised by Henry's directness. "Sir Edmund Vale died 4 years ago. Decent man, not a careful one. Left the estate in a state that required management it has not received. Lady Nora has been running the household on expectation since then." Expectation of what? Of Clara making a good match. James glanced across the room. "Which is why Lady Nora has had her dressed and positioned and aimed at every ball this season like a very determined piece of artillery." "And the middle daughter?" James considered this. "Helen Vale. I have seen her at 4 or 5 functions this season. She is not what society would call a prospect, by which I mean that society has not called her anything in particular. She is simply present or absent, and no one has noted the difference." He paused. "I did hear that she manages the household correspondence, and that the steward communicates with her rather than Lady Nora, when the news requires someone who will respond to it." Henry was quiet for a moment, watching the floor. "What society knows about Helen Vale," James continued, with the careful fairness of someone who considers accuracy a form of respect, "is less than what is probably true, which is not unusual. Society tends to know more about the people who want to be known." "She helped Mrs. Reed," Henry said. "Yes. Without being asked and without making a performance of it." "Yes. And then her sister made a remark." James's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. "The eldest sister makes frequent remarks. She is practiced at it." He looked at Henry. "You have been watching the east wall for 90 minutes. Henry said nothing. "I am not offering that as a criticism," James said. "I am offering it as information in case it is useful to you to know how it appears." "How does it appear?" James considered. "Purposeful," he said, honestly. "For a man who generally looks at nothing in particular, it appears purposeful." Henry looked away from the floor, back toward the windows, back toward the polite geography of a room full of people managing one another. Somewhere on the east wall, Clara laughed again, the bright social laugh, the one for an audience. Henry did not turn toward it. "Society has a version of that girl," he said, "and the version is wrong." James said nothing. He recognized the tone. He recognized what it meant when Henry named a thing in that particular quiet register, without inflection, as a simple statement of fact. He drank from his glass and said nothing, and let Henry think. The tray appeared at the worst possible moment, which was the sort of thing trays tended to do. A footman was navigating the edge of the floor during a gap between sets, carrying a tray of cordial glasses toward the refreshment table, and he misjudged the distance to an outstepped couple, and the tray tilted, and 3 glasses slid, and 2 of them struck the floor with the kind of sound that silences a 3-foot radius of conversation. No one was injured, no one's gown was ruined. It was, in the context of ballroom mishaps, minor, but the footman had gone pale, and the broken glass was on the floor, and people were looking, and Lady Nora Vale happened to be standing 2 feet away, which was the worst possible variable in an already unfortunate situation. Annabelle was nearest. She had been crossing the same stretch of floor on her way back from the coat room, and she was there before the sound had finished ringing, and she was crouching to collect the glass and managing the situation with the automatic efficiency of someone who is cleaned up after mishaps in fine houses for 3 years, and she was doing everything correctly except for the fact that she was visibly the nearest servant, and this was the kind of situation that required someone to carry the responsibility. Lady Nora turned. Her gaze settled on Anna with the flat precision of a woman who has decided where the fault lies. "What have you done?" Lady Nora said. It was not a question. Anna opened her mouth. She was 17, and she had been good tonight, careful and precise, and invisible in all the right ways, and the fear in her face was genuine and immediate. "The glass slipped from my hand," Helen said. She said it from behind Lady Nora in a clear, level voice, moving forward as she said it so that by the time Lady Nora turned she was already in view, already the obvious speaker, already the person taking the position. "I startled the footman when I stepped past him. I apologize. It was entirely my fault." Lady Nora looked at Helen. Helen looked back with the expression of a woman delivering a simple and accurate account of events. It was steady and direct, and it did not invite examination. "You are certain," Lady Nora said, which meant she was not certain, but was deciding whether to pursue it. "Yes," Helen said. Lady Nora held her gaze for a moment that contained several complicated things, and then she turned away, and the moment resolved, and the glass was collected, and the footman retreated, and Annabelle stood upright with her tray and met Helen's eyes for the second time that evening. This time the look lasted longer. Helen saw the gratitude in it, and something else beside the gratitude, the slightly bewildered look of someone who has not been protected recently enough that protection feels ordinary. Helen gave a small nod and looked away. She did not see Henry Grey standing near the cardroom entrance, still as furniture, watching. She did not see the way his expression had shifted, just slightly, just enough to show that something in what he had just witnessed had crossed from observation into something that required more specific attention. He had seen her take a wound that did not belong to her. He had seen her do it without hesitation and without performance. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked for Lord James. Rose Vale was not cruel by nature. This was the complicated thing about Rose, the thing that made her harder to resolve than Clara, who was cruel by calculation and therefore at least legible. Rose was 18 and frightened, and she had grown up in the particular shadow of a beautiful, confident older sister in a household where beauty and confidence were the currencies that bought safety. She had learned, the way younger siblings in unequal houses learn things, to attach herself to the source of light and warmth and to stay there, because the alternative was the outer dark. She did not think about this in these terms. She simply knew that when Clara was pleased, the household breathed, and when Clara was not pleased, it did not. She found Helen near the second column during the interval between the third and fourth sets, and she found her because she had been looking, which was already, for Rose, unusual. "Helen," she said. Helen looked at her. The thing with the glass," Rose said. She stopped. She had a habit of stopping in the middle of sentences when what she was about to say required more courage than she had assembled yet. It was nothing, Helen said. It was not nothing. Anna would have been. Rose stopped again. Mother would have another stop. It was not nothing, she repeated less steadily. Helen watched her sister's face. She had watched Rose for 18 years. She knew the architecture of Rose's guilt, the same way she knew the architecture of Lady Nora's decisions and Clara's cruelties, because she had been paying attention to all of them for the entirety of her life, and they had been paying significantly less attention to her. I know about the dance card, Helen said quietly. Rose went still. I am not going to cause a scene about it, Helen said. I am telling you because I think some part of you would prefer that I knew. Rose looked at the floor. Her fan was in her hands and she was moving it slightly, not with the deliberate elegance of Clara's fan work, but with the involuntary motion of someone who needs something to do with their hands while they are feeling something they have not given themselves permission to feel. Clara said you would try to take the Duke from her, Rose said, to the floor. She said you have been trying all evening. And do you believe that? Helen asked. Rose looked up. The answer was in her face before she could decide what to do with it. No, she did not believe it. She had not believed it when Clara said it, and she had laughed anyway, and she was standing here now, because she was carrying the weight of that laughter and had not yet figured out where to put it down. Clara appeared at Rose's shoulder, as if she had been waiting just outside the frame of the conversation. There you are, Clara said to Rose pleasantly, and with the complete absence of acknowledgement that Helen was present. Pembridge is asking after you. Come. Rose looked at Helen once more. The look was brief and complicated and contained, Helen thought, the beginning of something that had not yet become a decision. Then she followed Clara. Helen watched them go and felt no satisfaction, because there was no satisfaction in being right about the things that hurt you. The balcony door was behind the third column on the north side of the ballroom, half hidden by a heavy velvet drape, and Helen had located it 40 minutes ago in the way that people who are not entirely comfortable in rooms learn to locate exits. She waited until the fourth set was underway, and the room's attention was directed toward the floor, and then she slipped through the drape and out through the door and into the cold. It was a proper winter cold, the kind with teeth, and the contrast with the candlelit warmth of the ballroom was sharp enough to make her breath catch. The balcony was narrow and stone-railed and looked out over the Ashford garden, which was dark and geometric and leafless in the December night. No one else was out here. She had expected that. She had counted on it. She stood at the railing and breathed in, out. The cold was not pleasant, but it was honest, which was more than she could say for the room she had just left. She looked at the dark garden and felt the knot between her shoulders begin, very slowly, to release. She had perhaps 2 minutes before absence became noticeable. She intended to use them. She was still looking at the garden when she heard the balcony door open behind her. She turned, expecting Anna, or possibly one of Lady Ashford's housemaids, and found Lord Victor Hale. He stepped out with the relaxed ease of a man who has followed someone and does not see the need to conceal it, and he pulled the door closed behind him and smiled at her in the low winter light. Miss Vale, he said, taking the air. Helen looked at him directly. I am. A cold night for it. Yes. Victor moved to the railing, not beside her but at an angle, close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be deniable. He looked out at the garden with the comfortable posture of a man in no hurry. I want to be plain with you, he said, abandoning the social pleasantries with the ease of someone who had only been using them as a formality. The Duke of Blackmoor has been watching you this evening. Helen said nothing. I am sure you have noticed, Victor said. You are not an unobservant woman. This is the difficulty. He turned toward her slightly. A man of his position, observed to pay attention to a woman of your position, creates a story, and stories are currency in rooms like that one. Clara's prospects are delicate. You know this. I know you know this. What is it you are asking me, Lord Victor? Helen said. I am asking you, he said pleasantly, to remember where you are in this family. To remember that whatever the Duke may appear to notice this evening, his notice does not change your circumstances, and drawing on it, using it, trading on it, would be a serious error. A pause. For everyone, it was a threat laid inside the frame of advice. She recognized the structure. She had heard Victor use it before. In drawing rooms and at dinner tables, always the same architecture. A reasonable sentence followed by a consequence shaped like a suggestion. I have not sought the Duke's attention, Helen said. No, Victor agreed, but you have not avoided it either. She looked at him steadily. Her heart was moving faster than she wished it to. Not from fear of Victor himself, exactly, but from the fear of what he represented, the machinery of social consequence that he was capable of operating, and that she had no equivalent access to. I would advise you, Victor continued, his voice dropping, to go back inside, return to your corner, and allow this evening to conclude as it should. For your family's sake, for Clara's sake. The smile again, thin and final, and for your own. He had not touched her. He had not needed to. The threat was entirely structural, a cage made of implications. Helen gripped the railing and kept her breathing steady and said nothing. She was not going to let him see her afraid. The balcony door opened a second time. Victor turned, and the expression that crossed his face was brief and did not improve him. He recovered it quickly, but not quickly enough. Henry Grey stepped onto the balcony. He took in the scene with one glance, the particular kind of glance that moves fast and records everything. And then he looked at Victor with the calm, settled attention of a man who has arrived at the correct moment and knows it. Hail, he said. Your Grace, Victor said, with the smooth recalibration of a man switching registers. A cold night to be outside. It is, Henry agreed. He did not look away from Victor. He did not offer any additional statement. He simply held the space with the steady, occupying presence of someone who has more authority in his silence than most men have in speech. Victor looked between Henry and Helen. He made the calculation that the situation required. He inclined his head smoothly and without visible hurry, and said something pleasant about the cold, and returned through the balcony door with the controlled pace of a man who has chosen to leave rather than been made to leave, which was better for his dignity, and he knew it. The door clicked shut. Helen released the railing. The cold was very clear around them, and the garden was very dark, and the sound of the ballroom was muffled to a low, warm blur behind the glass. She was aware acutely of the space between herself and Henry Grey, and of the fact that she did not know what came next. Are you safe? He said. It was a direct question, practical and quiet, without the theatrical concern of someone performing rescue. He was asking because he wanted to know. Helen looked at him. She looked at him properly, the way she had not yet done, face to face without the length of a ballroom between them, and she found a set of dark, careful eyes that were watching her with attention, that was not pity and not performance. I am used to being safe enough, she said. It came out more honest than she had intended. She had meant it as a deflection. It landed as the truth. Henry looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, quiet and serious. The look of a man who has heard an answer that has told him considerably more than the person who gave it intended. Safe enough, he repeated, very quietly, is not the same thing as safe. Helen had no answer for that. The music started again inside. The fourth set in full measure, pressing through the glass. Somewhere in the ballroom, Clara was laughing. Somewhere, Rose was following. Somewhere, Lady Nora was watching the room with the calculating patience of a woman who needed this night to go correctly. Helen stood on a cold balcony in winter dark and looked at a man she did not know, and understood that something had shifted tonight in a direction she had not predicted, and that whatever came next, nothing was going to be as simple as standing at the wall and folding her hands and waiting to go home. Henry held the door open for her. She stepped inside. The Vale house on Weston Street was not a large house, but it had been arranged to suggest that it was. This was Lady Nora's doing. She had a talent for implication, for placing a mirror at the end of a corridor so that the corridor appeared to continue, for arranging furniture in a drawing room so that the eye moved toward the window and the light rather than toward the walls, which were beginning, in certain corners, to show their age. The house said, "We are a family of standing," and it said it convincingly enough that most visitors did not look closely enough to find the evidence to the contrary. Helen had been up since 6. She was at the writing desk in the back bedroom by 1:30, with the household accounts open in front of her and a candle burning because the December light came late and gray through the window. She had the letter from Mr. Finch beside the accounts, and she was working through the numbers with the careful, focused attention of someone who knows that the numbers are going to be unpleasant and has decided to find out exactly how unpleasant before the rest of the house woke up and the day became complicated. They were very unpleasant. She wrote 3 columns of figures and checked them twice, and arrived at the same answer both times, which was that the Vale family had approximately 6 weeks before the gap between what was owed and what was available became a gap that could not be managed with correspondence and careful phrasing. 6 weeks if Clara made a match. 8, possibly, if the match was a good one. Without a match, the answer was a different number entirely, and she was not ready to write that number down yet. She closed the accounts and sat for a moment in the early morning quiet. Downstairs she could hear the kitchen beginning, the careful sounds of a household waking up. Mrs. Draper, the cook, moving pots, the youngest housemaid, whose name was Bess, and who was 14, and perpetually slightly behind schedule, hurrying across the flagstones. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a house that did not know it was in difficulty, or that had decided not to think about the difficulty until it became impossible not to. Helen looked at the letter from Mr. Finch and thought about the balcony. She had been trying not to think about the balcony since she returned to the ballroom, and she had been largely unsuccessful. Not Victor's part of it, which she had filed under known threats requiring management and set aside. The other part, the door opening, the look that had taken in the scene and understood it in a single glance. The question, "Are you safe?" She had answered it badly. She had answered it the way she answered most things, sideways and deflecting, from behind the arrangement of features that said nothing is happening here. And he had seen through it with a quietness that she found, even now, in the cold gray morning, with the accounts in front of her and the day about to start, disconcerting. Safe enough is not the same thing as safe. She picked up her pen and returned to the figures, and did not think about it anymore, with a determination that did not entirely succeed. Clara came downstairs at 9, which was early for Clara, and she came with the contained energy of someone who has been lying awake, making plans, and has finally given herself permission to begin executing them. She found Helen at the breakfast table, and sat down across from her, and poured tea with the brisk, precise movements of a woman who has decided something and is not yet ready to say what. Helen watched her over the rim of her cup. "Lord Pembridge will call today," Clara said. "I expect so," Helen said. "He was attentive last night." "He is not the only one who may call," Clara said, and the way she said it had a particular quality, a careful, measuring tone that Helen associated with the moments when Clara was about to say something that required a frame to be built around it first. Helen waited. "The Duke was in the room last night," Clara said. "Yes, James Hart was with him. Lord James was at the Featherington dinner last month. I spoke with him briefly. He is observant." A pause. "He and the Duke are close." "I know," Helen said. Clara set down her cup. She looked at Helen directly, which she did not always do, and the directness had a quality that was not quite threat. It was something more complicated than threat. It was the look of a woman who is frightened and is trying to manage her fear by managing the person in front of her. "I need you to understand something," Clara said. "If the Duke has any intention of paying a call to this house, it will be because of last night, and whatever impression he formed last night, I intend to correct this morning." Helen looked at her. "What impression do you believe he formed?" "I believe he spent a significant portion of the evening looking at the east wall," Clara said precisely, "which is not an impression that serves anyone well." Helen said nothing. "He is the Duke of Blackmoor," Clara said, and the way she said it contained everything she had been trained to feel about titles and prospects and the particular alchemy of a good match, all of it compressed into a name. He is not a curiosity. He is not an evening's entertainment. He is the difference between this family continuing as it is and this family becoming something that cannot continue. It was the most honest thing Clara had said to her in months. Helen recognized it as such and felt, in spite of everything, the complexity of it, because Clara was frightened, genuinely, underneath the positioning and the calculation. And fear was not a quality that made Clara likable, but it made her legible, and legibility was something. "I will not stand in your way," Helen said. "No," Clara agreed. "You will not." She picked up her cup again and returned to the business of breakfast, and the conversation closed the way Clara's conversations tended to close, without discussion of what had actually been said. Helen finished her tea and went back upstairs to the accounts and thought, very carefully, about the difference between not standing in someone's way and actively removing yourself from their path, and whether what Clara was asking for was the first or the second. Henry Grey had been awake since 5. This was not unusual. He was a man who slept lightly and woke early and used the morning hours the way a craftsman uses good light to do the work that required the clearest sight. He had been at his desk by 5:30 with correspondence that needed attention and an estate report that had arrived from Blackmoor 3 days ago, and that he had been working through in sections because the detail required patience. By 8 o'clock the correspondence was done. The report was annotated, and Henry was standing at the window of his study with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and watching the street below wake up with the grey gradual efficiency of a London December morning. He was thinking about the balcony. He was thinking about Helen Vale, specifically, and about the way she had answered his question, and about the particular architecture of Safe Enough, which was the architecture of someone who had long ago adjusted their expectations downward to match what was available, and had then adjusted so many times that they had stopped noticing the adjustment. He was thinking about Victor Hale. Victor was not a man Henry liked, which was not in itself significant. There were many men Henry did not like. Victor was a man Henry watched, which was different and more informative. He watched him because Victor had a habit of positioning himself near leverage and applying it quietly in the register of advice or concern or social observation in a way that was difficult to name and therefore difficult to address. He had been doing this for years. Henry had seen it done to other people and had filed it and moved on, because the people it was done to had not been in a position he could usefully address. Last night had been different. He set down the cold coffee and turned from the window. James arrived at 9:30, in the easy, unhurried way that James arrived at things, and he accepted coffee and a chair in Henry's study, and looked at Henry with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding in what order to say it. "You went onto the balcony," James said. "Yes." Victor Hale was on the balcony. "Yes." And Helen Vale was on the balcony. "Yes," Henry said. "And you, in your great capacity for spontaneous social instinct," James said pleasantly, "happened to choose that particular cold corner of the evening to take the air." Henry said nothing. James drank his coffee. I am not asking you to explain yourself. I am simply noting that the thing you said last night about the version being wrong has apparently moved from observation to intention, and I want to make sure you have thought about it. I have thought about it. She is a woman without a position, James said carefully, without prospects by society's reckoning, with a family that has active reasons to manage her circumstances in a specific direction. He paused. Whatever you noticed last night, the world noticed before you and decided a particular thing about it, and what you do next will be measured against that decision. I am aware, Henry said. Good, James said. Then you are also aware that if you call on the Vale house today, it will not be interpreted as a courtesy. Henry looked at him evenly. No, he agreed. It will not. James held his gaze for a moment, measuring, and then he set down his cup with the small, precise motion of a man arriving at acceptance. What time were you thinking? He said. The knocker sounded at 11. Helen heard it from the upstairs landing, where she had been returning a set of mended curtain rings to the linen cupboard, and she knew, from the particular quality of the sound, that it was not a tradesman's knock. It was the kind of knock that expected to be answered well. She moved to the top of the stairs and looked down. Bess opened the door. Helen heard a voice, low and clear and unhurried, and heard Bess make the small surprised sound of a housemaid who has opened a door, expecting someone of no particular consequence, and found the opposite. Then she heard her mother. Lady Nora appeared from the drawing room with the contained speed of a woman who has been listening for exactly this knock since 9 o'clock that morning. She arrived at the entrance hall with her shoulders back and her face arranged in the particular expression of gracious but unsurprised welcome that she had been perfecting since girlhood. Helen leaned over the banister, just slightly. Henry Grey stepped into the entrance hall of the Vale house and handed his hat and gloves to Bess, and looked around the entrance hall with the calm, interested attention of a man seeing a place for the first time and making no judgment about it. He had James Hart beside him. James was looking at a watercolor on the entrance hall wall, with what appeared to be genuine interest. Lady Nora said something. Helen could not hear the words, but she heard the tone, warm and correctly pitched, the tone of a woman receiving an expected guest whom she is pleased but not overwhelmed to see. Henry said something in return, and then, with the unhurried timing that seemed to be characteristic of him, he looked up. He found her immediately. She was on the landing, with a set of curtain rings in her hand, and no particular reason to be standing there. And she was aware, like exactly what she was, which was a woman who had heard the knock and come to see who it was, and had not quite had the time or the warning to retreat before being found. He looked at her for just a moment. Not long, long enough, he did not smile. He simply acknowledged her with the directness that she was beginning to understand was his normal mode, a look that said, I see you there, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And then he returned his attention to Lady Nora as she moved toward the drawing room. Helen stood on the landing with the curtain rings and felt heat move into her face and felt strongly and absurdly that she had been caught at something without being at all certain what. She put the curtain rings away and went downstairs. The drawing room had been arranged by Lady Nora at some point between 8 and 11, in a manner that suggested it was always like this, which it was not. The good cushions were on the chairs. The small table near the window, which usually held the household ledgers when Helen was working at it, had been cleared, and the silver tea service placed on it instead. The fire was built up. The curtains were drawn at the precise angle that let in the flattering gray winter light, while concealing the section of wall near the chimney breast that needed repainting. Clara was seated in the best chair, in the position that made the most of the window light. She was wearing the blue morning gown, which was her most becoming everyday dress, and her hair was dressed with a simplicity that was more expensive looking than any of the elaborate ballroom styles. And she held a book in her lap that she was not reading, but that looked extremely natural there. She had been positioned for 45 minutes. Rose was on the smaller settee to Clara's left, arranged decoratively, and furnished with instruction to be charming and unobtrusive in equal measure. Helen came in last and took the chair near the door, which was the chair that was left after the better seats had been distributed, and which she occupied without comment. Lady Nora poured tea. Henry Grey sat in the chair across from Clara and accepted the cup with the ease of a man who is comfortable in drawing rooms without belonging to any particular one, and he and Lady Nora exchanged the appropriate opening exchanges about the ball, the weather, the Ashford hospitality, while James occupied himself in conversation with Rose and demonstrated the particular gift of a sociable man who can make any person in any room feel that they are the most interesting thing in it. Clara was performing at a level Helen recognized as exceptional even by Clara's standards. She was witty without being sharp, engaged without being eager, and she was doing it all with the practiced ease of someone who is prepared thoroughly and is now trusting the preparation. Henry was polite. He was attentive. He asked the correct questions and listened to the answers, and smiled at the appropriate moments, and gave, as far as Helen could tell, no indication of what he was actually thinking. She was watching him from the chair by the door, and she was watching him with the attention she gave to problems that required solving, cataloging the way he held the cup, the way his eyes moved when someone spoke, the particular quality of stillness that settled over him when the conversation asked nothing specific of him. He was a very contained man. She could not read him. And then Lady Nora said something to James, and the conversation in the room divided for a moment. Clara and Lady Nora, with Lord James, and the division created a brief pocket of relative quiet, and Henry turned his head and looked at Helen directly. "How is your morning, Miss Vale?" he said. It was a simple question. It was a question that, in ordinary circumstances, would receive an ordinary answer. But it was directed at her from across the room, in a voice that did not lower itself to anything secret, but that pitched itself for her specifically. And it was accompanied by the same direct, unperformative attention she had seen on the balcony, and Helen found that she did not, for once, know what to do with being addressed as though her answer was the thing that was being asked for. "Productive," she said. "Thank you." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the near relative of one. "I am glad," he said. And then Lady Nora's attention returned to the room, and the conversation reknitted itself, and Clara reclaimed the center of it with an ease that was almost admirable, and Henry returned his attention to the room at large. But Helen sat with the word productive for the rest of the visit, and thought about how much she had meant it, and how much it had cost her nothing to say so, and how strange that was, and how strange he was, and how none of it was anything she had planned for. The letter arrived that afternoon. It came addressed to Lady Nora in Victor Hale's handwriting, which Helen recognized because she had seen it before on social correspondence that passed through the house when Victor was managing his approach to Clara. She would not normally have read it. She was not given to reading her mother's correspondence, partly from principle, and partly because Lady Nora's correspondence was usually so carefully composed on both sides that reading it felt like eating sand. But Lady Nora left it on the parlor table when she went upstairs to rest, and it was open, and Helen was crossing the room to return a book to the shelf. And she read it in the way you read something that is directly in your path and directly lit and written in a large enough hand. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was pleasantries. The second was a delicate, beautifully structured expression of interest in Clara, framed in the language of admiration and correct social intention. The third was the one that mattered. It contained, in the careful phrasing of a man who knows how to say a damaging thing without appearing to say it. A suggestion. The suggestion was this: that the Duke of Blackmoor, while a man of great standing, was a man with well-known requirements in terms of family character and household management, and that any interest he might appear to show should not be encouraged without a full understanding of his history and expectations, and that Lady Nora might find it beneficial to consult with Victor before drawing any conclusions from the morning visit. And then, in the last sentence of the third paragraph, very quietly, the blade, that it would be unfortunate if a misreading of the Duke's intentions were to complicate the excellent prospects that Clara already had, prospects that were reliable and certain, and that Victor himself was in a position to support. Helen stood at the parlor table and read it twice. She understood it completely. Victor was telling Lady Nora that Henry's attention was unreliable, and that relying on it was a risk, and that Victor was the safer and more certain alternative, and that Lady Nora should manage the household accordingly, which meant managing Helen accordingly. She also understood that Victor had written this letter within hours of the morning visit, which meant he had intelligence of the morning visit, which meant he was watching the Vale house, or watching Henry, or both, with an attention that was neither casual nor benign. She put the letter back exactly as it had been. She went upstairs to the back bedroom and sat at the writing desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Victor was afraid of Henry's attention. That was the information. That was what the letter, stripped of its careful phrasing, actually said. She found this, despite everything, very interesting indeed. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens when a person who has spent years not being permitted to want things suddenly finds themselves in a situation where wanting something seems briefly possible. It is not a comfortable kind of thinking. It is close to pain, because it requires looking directly at the shape of the absence that has been managed and compensated for and papered over for so long that the person has almost forgotten it is absence, rather than simply the ordinary texture of their life. Helen sat at the writing desk and did this kind of thinking. She thought about Henry Grey in the drawing room, asking how her morning was and meaning it, which was a small thing, but which had landed in a place in her chest that she recognized as the place where small things that matter land. She thought about the balcony, and safe enough, and the door held open with the unhurried courtesy of a man who does not make you feel that the courtesy is an imposition on him. She thought about the fact that she was 22 years old and had spent the last 4 years running a household that was not in her name, managing money that was not in her accounts, writing letters that were signed by other people, mending gloves and curtain rings and the seams of gowns and the dignity of situations that had come apart in inconvenient places, and she had done all of this without being asked, which meant she had done it because she was the person who did things without being asked, and no one had ever in her memory asked her what she wanted in return. Henry Grey had asked if she was safe. It was not the same thing as asking what she wanted, but it was the first time in a very long time that someone had looked at her circumstances and asked questions that assumed her circumstances were something that could be different. She thought about this carefully with the methodical honesty she brought to the household accounts, and she arrived at the following. She was not a fool. She knew what she was in the world's reckoning. She knew that a duke did not cross a ballroom for a woman with a blank dance card and no prospects in a family held together by careful letters and mended gloves. She knew that this morning's visit had been, from the world's perspective, about Clara, and that whatever personal direction his attention had taken was a private and unreliable thing that she should not build anything on. She knew all of this, and she also knew, with the same honesty, that something had shifted last night, in the cold on the balcony, and that the shifting had happened in her as much as in any external circumstance. and that what had shifted was this. She was tired of being invisible, and she was furious about being managed, and she was not, she found, willing to disappear for Clara, or for Victor, or for her mother's fear, and the finding of that unwillingness was new and frightening. And, underneath the fright, something felt almost recklessly like relief. She opened the accounts and looked at the numbers. 6 weeks. If Clara made a match, she picked up her pen. Henry Gray called again on Thursday. This was not what anyone expected. Lady Nora received the intelligence at 10 in the morning from the Featherington housekeeper, who had heard it from Lady Featherington, who had heard it from Lord James Hart at a breakfast engagement, that the Duke of Blackmoor had mentioned, in the course of an ordinary conversation, that he intended to return to the Vale house later in the week to pursue an acquaintance he found worthwhile. The word worthwhile had apparently been used. Lady Nora sat with this information for 20 minutes in the drawing room, alone, before she called for Clara. Helen, passing the drawing room door with the morning's correspondence, heard her name, not directed at her. Directed Clara inside the room by Lady Nora, in the low, rapid, carefully controlled voice that meant the conversation was important and must not carry. She stopped. She did not press her ear to the door. She stood in the corridor with the correspondence in her hand and heard, not every word, but enough. Worthwhile, Lady Nora said, and then, not Clara, and then a pause and the sound of Clara, who was not a woman who showed fear readily, making a sound that was close to it, and then Lady Nora, even lower. We must be very careful how we proceed. Helen stood in the corridor for another moment. Then she moved away, her steps even, her face arranged. She went to the back bedroom and closed the door and stood with the correspondence in her hand and understood something that she had been trying, with good sense and practiced restraint, to hold at arm's length. Henry Gray had used the word worthwhile. She did not know what he meant by it. She did not know what he intended. She did not know if she was being foolish or hopeful or both, which were not always distinguishable from each other at this distance. But she knew what worthwhile meant in its ordinary sense, and she knew that he had said it, and that he had said it about an acquaintance at the Vale house, and that he was coming back on Thursday, and that these were facts, not feelings, and she could work with facts. She set the correspondence on the desk. She sat down. She let herself, for the first time, consider the possibility that the story she had been assigned to live might not be the only story available. It was a terrifying thought. It was also, she found, with the careful honesty she brought to everything, the most alive she had felt in years. Wednesday night, Lady Nora did not sleep. Helen knew this because she heard her mother's footsteps on the landing, at 2 in the morning, at 4, and again just before 6, the particular careful tread of a woman who does not want to wake the house, but cannot stay in one place. Helen lay in the dark of the back bedroom and listened to the footsteps and thought about the word worthwhile, and did not sleep particularly well, herself, though for different reasons. By 7 the house was awake, and by 8 it was in motion with the focused, slightly frantic energy of a household that has been given a target and a deadline. Bess was sent to beat the drawing-room carpet before breakfast. Mrs. Draper received instructions about the afternoon refreshments that were detailed enough to suggest Lady Nora had been composing them in the dark somewhere between 2 and 4. The good china, which lived in the back of the sideboard under a cloth, and came out for occasions that merited it, was brought forward and washed and dried and arranged on the tray with a precision that bordered on ceremony. Clara submitted to all of this with a controlled, surface-level composure that Helen recognized as the composure of someone who is very frightened and is managing it through action. She approved the china. She approved the arrangement of chairs. She went upstairs twice to consult with her reflection and came down both times looking exactly as she had before, which was beautiful, and which was not going to be the problem. Helen watched all of this from the edges of the morning, fetching and carrying, and managing the small logistical questions that Bess brought her rather than Lady Nora, because Bess had learned, as all the household had learned, that Helen was the one who answered without sighing. She pressed a tablecloth. She located the missing sugar tongs. She found the specific shade of ribbon that Clara needed for her hair and had not asked for directly, but had mentioned twice in a tone that meant she needed it found. She did all of this without being asked to, which was her habit, and without resentment, which was what she told herself, and with a feeling underneath the no resentment that was more complicated, which was what was actually true. At 10, Lady Nora found her in the linen cupboard. "You will be in the drawing room this afternoon," Lady Nora said. Helen looked at her. "You asked me last week to be invisible. Last week the situation was different." Lady Nora's voice was flat and precise. "He is coming to see an acquaintance he finds worthwhile. Until I understand which acquaintance, you will be present, and you will be unremarkable, and you will not give him anything to look at." Helen understood the instruction. She was to be present enough to be accounted for, and unremarkable enough to be dismissed. She was to occupy a chair and take up no space, and allow the afternoon to resolve in Clara's favor by the process of Clara being in the room and being herself. "Yes," Helen said. "Of course." Lady Nora left. Helen stood in the linen cupboard with a stack of pressed pillowcases and thought about the instruction to give him nothing to look at, and felt quietly, and with precision, the particular fury of being managed with such confidence. The confidence of someone who has never once considered that the managed person might have preferences of her own. She put the pillowcases away and went to find the sugar tongs. He came at 10:30. No one had invited him, which was characteristic of Victor, and which was also, Helen recognized immediately, strategic. He arrived on the doorstep of the Vale house with the relaxed assurance of a man paying a social call, which he was, and with a specific timing that placed him in the house before Henry arrived, which was the point. Lady Nora received him in the entrance hall with an expression that contained, briefly, a flicker of something that was not pleasure before she adjusted it into welcome. Victor was charming. He was always charming. He had brought a small arrangement of winter flowers, which was a thoughtful touch, and he inquired after everyone's health with the attentive warmth of a man who considers people worth attending to, which he did, in the way a chess player considers pieces worth attending to. He was installed in the drawing room with tea before Helen appeared on the stairs. He looked up at her and smiled the full social smile and said, "Miss Vale, how well you look this morning." Helen came down the stairs at a pace that gave nothing away and took the chair near the window. The chair that had become, through repetition, her chair in this room, the one in the corner that was not the best chair, but was also not the worst, the one that nobody particularly wanted. "Lord Victor," she said pleasantly. "I was just telling your mother," Victor said, settling back in his chair with the ease of a man in a room he intends to occupy, "that I have been reflecting on the season so far. It has been a very good season, very productive." He used the word with his eyes on Helen, a small, precise placement, a reminder. Helen looked at him steadily and said nothing. Clara appeared shortly after, dressed for the afternoon, and the drawing room rearranged itself around her entrance, the way it always did, because Clara had the quality of making rooms feel as though they had been waiting for her to arrive before they could properly begin. Victor stood and greeted her with a warmth that was calibrated to suggest particular regard, and Clara received it with the gracious composure of a woman who knows she is being courted and is reserving judgment. The conversation moved. Victor was in excellent form, attentive and witty and carefully positioned, and Lady Nora was filling her role with the precise hospitality of a woman who is holding two possibilities in her mind simultaneously, and has not yet decided which to tend. Helen sat by the window and watched the garden and understood that Victor's early arrival was a fence, clearly constructed. He wanted to be established in the room before Henry arrived. He wanted the geometry of the afternoon to have already been set. She also understood that Victor had made a small error in coming at all. He would not have come if he was not worried. And if he was worried, it was because Henry, for reasons Victor had not yet fully mapped, was not doing what Victor expected him to do. This information settled in Helen's chest with a quiet, careful warmth. The knocker sounded at 11 exactly. Victor's expression did not change. This, Helen noted, took him a small effort, just small enough to be visible to someone who was watching for it. Bess opened the door. Lady Nora rose with the controlled swiftness of a woman who is managing two guests and one objective simultaneously. There was the sound of the entrance hall, the low voices, the particular pause of a man taking stock of a space before moving through it. Henry came into the drawing room behind Lady Nora and took in the arrangement of people in it with one of those fast, complete glances that Helen was beginning to recognize as one of his defining characteristics. He saw Clara in the good chair. He saw Lady Nora returning to her seat. He saw Victor, who rose and offered his hand with the smooth, practiced ease of a man performing a normal social greeting that is not a territorial gesture. "Blackmoor," Victor said pleasantly. "Hail," Henry said, shaking the hand with the neutral efficiency of a man completing a required motion. His eyes moved on. He found Helen in the corner by the window, and the finding was not the searching kind. It was the kind where a person already knows approximately where to look and looks there. He met her gaze for a moment, and the moment contained the specific acknowledgement of two people who have had a conversation in a cold exterior space and are now in a warm interior one, and are deciding what, if anything, to do with the continuity. Helen looked back at him, with the arrangement of features that said nothing in particular. He sat in the chair that Lady Nora indicated, which was positioned, Helen noticed, between Clara and the window, and therefore between Clara and herself, which was the kind of geometry Lady Nora was very good at, and which had presumably been thought through during the hours she was not sleeping. "We are so pleased you could join us," Lady Nora said, and she was excellent, entirely warm and composed, and projecting the sense of a household that had not been cleaning the carpet at 7 in the morning. "The pleasure is mine," Henry said, and he said it with sufficient conviction to be courteous and insufficient inflection to be a declaration, which, Helen suspected, was exactly the amount he had decided to mean. Victor began to speak. He launched into a story about a mutual acquaintance at last week's Grenville supper, something about a debate over horse breeding that had apparently become spirited enough to require the intervention of the hostess, and he told it well, with the practiced ease of a man who has learned that controlling the conversation is often as simple as being the first person to speak and being entertaining enough that no one interrupts. Clara laughed at the right moment. Lady Nora smiled. Henry listened with the polite attention of a man who is present in a conversation without being inside it. Helen watched the garden and waited. Lady Nora, at 11:20, did a thing Helen had not anticipated. She stood with the smooth pretext of refreshments, and she took Clara's arm and Rose's arm, and she said something to Lord James Hart, who had arrived shortly after Henry, and who had been in conversation with Rose with the genuine warmth of a man who finds young women of 18 mostly delightful and occasionally alarming, and she reorganized the drawing room. James was redirected to the window seat with Rose. Lady Nora and Clara moved toward the door, on the pretext of directing Mrs. Draper about the tray, which did not require two people, but which Lady Nora had decided required exactly two people, those two, for a period of approximately 5 minutes. This left Henry in his chair, Victor in his, and Helen by the window. Victor looked at the door through which Lady Nora and Clara had just passed then looked at Helen with the specific expression of a man who has had the rug moved without having time to decide what to do about it. Henry did not look at the door. He looked at Helen. "Miss Vale," he said, "I have been thinking about something you said." Victor's attention sharpened. Helen felt it without looking at him. "I said a number of things," Helen said. "You said safe enough." He said it simply, without the framing of a man who wants something from the words, simply returning them as a matter of accuracy. "I have been thinking about it since Thursday." It was a careless answer, Helen said. It was an honest one, he said, which is less common than it should be in rooms like these. Victor set down his cup with a small, precise sound. "I wonder, Blackmoor, whether you had a chance to look at Fenwick's proposal about the Ashford Road improvements." "I had thoughts about the eastern stretch." Henry looked at Victor. The look was not unfriendly, it was not hostile. It was the look of a man acknowledging that a thing has been said and placing it in an accurate category and choosing, with complete composure, not to respond to it. Then he returned his attention to Helen. "You manage the household correspondence," he said. It was not a question. Helen looked at him steadily. "I assist with it. James tells me the steward corresponds with you." "Lord James is observant," Helen said. "He is," Henry agreed. "It is one of his most useful qualities. A pause, brief and not uncomfortable. Do you enjoy it?" "The correspondence, the management." The question caught her slightly off balance, because it was not the question she had been preparing for. She had been preparing for something that required deflection. This required an answer. "I find it," she said carefully, "more satisfying than standing at a wall." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, again, but closer to it than before. "I expect you do," he said. Victor said, "The eastern stretch is particularly interesting from an engineering perspective. I think you would find—" "Hail," Henry said, without heat, without volume, and with a quality of finality that was entirely polite and also entirely conclusive. "I will read the proposal." Victor was quiet. Lady Nora reappeared in the doorway, with Clara and the expression of a woman who has been absent for 5 minutes and has returned to find the room in a configuration she did not arrange. Clara sat down. She sat down in the chair nearest Henry with the graceful decisiveness of a woman who has surveyed a situation and made a tactical choice, and she brought with her the full force of what she was, which was a great deal. She was charming, she was radiant. She was funny in the precise, self-aware way that suggests intelligence as well as wit, and she directed this at Henry with the focused warmth of a woman who has identified a target and is now not aiming so much as simply being her most considerable self in the direction of it. Henry responded to her. He was not cold, he was not unpleasant. He engaged with the wit and returned the conversation with genuine participation. And for 15 minutes, the drawing room felt like what it was supposed to feel like, an agreeable Thursday morning call between people who had no particular difficulty with one another. Helen watched this from the window. She watched it with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who has learned to look at things as they are, rather than as she would prefer them to be, because looking at things clearly is what you do when you have no particular margin for error. She watched Clara be extraordinary. She watched Henry be genuinely engaged. She watched Victor relax slightly in his chair. The relaxation of a man who is watching a situation resolve in the direction he intended, she thought. This is the more likely story. This is the version of this morning that makes sense. Clara was the story that made sense. Clara was the prospective match that the world had been pointing towards since the ball. Clara was beautiful and accomplished, and in possession of all the social credentials that Henry Grey would reasonably require, and Lady Nora had arranged them both in this room with the precision of a woman who knows what she is doing. And Victor was here to shore up the structure, and the structure was, if Helen examined it with honesty, probably the correct structure. She had been foolish, she thought, to take the word worthwhile. and build something inside it. She looked at the garden. The December garden, bare and geometrical and honest about what it was. And then Henry said something to Clara, something courteous and concluding, the kind of conversational movement that wraps up a thread rather than continuing it. And he turned his head and looked at Helen. Not at the window. At her. "Miss Vale," he said across the room with a directness that did not particularly care who else in the room heard it. "You have been quiet." Clara's chin lifted by a fraction. Victor became very still. "I have been comfortable," Helen said. "That is not the same thing," he said. It landed in the room and sat there. Helen recognized the line because she had been the one to give it to him, in a different form, on a cold balcony. And here he was returning it to her in a warm drawing room in front of her mother and her sister and Victor Hale. And the returning of it was not accidental. Lady Nora said smoothly and immediately, "We are so fortunate in today's weather, given how the week began." And the room took the social lifeline, and the conversation moved, and the moment was covered over. But it had happened, and everyone in the room had heard it. Victor did not stay for luncheon. He made his excuses at noon, with the pleasant efficiency of a man who has decided that the morning has not gone as well as he intended and is cutting his losses before the afternoon adds to the cost. He said the correct things to Lady Nora, said something appreciative to Clara, nodded to Henry, and was gone. Helen saw him to the door because Bess was occupied with the luncheon tray and Lady Nora was engaged with the tea things, and it was the kind of small household gap that Helen filled automatically, without decision. In the entrance hall, away from the drawing room, Victor stopped. He turned to her. The social smile was still in place, but it was thinner now, stretched over something beneath it that was harder and less pleasant. "You should understand something," he said very quietly. "I usually try to," Helen said. "I have influence in this world that you do not have access to, Miss Vale. I have connections that bear directly on your family's circumstances. What Mr. Finch is managing, the debt, the timeline, the options available at the end of it," he held her gaze, "are all affected by decisions that people in my position make." Helen looked at him. She kept her face composed, and her breathing even, and felt the cold of it. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of something with real weight, a real thing that could do real damage. "I have not done anything," she said. "No," Victor agreed. "Not yet." The smile adjusted slightly. "Not warmer, but more precise. I am simply ensuring that you have the information you need to make good decisions going forward." Helen said nothing. "Your family needs Clara to make a match," Victor said. "I am in a position to be that match. It is the correct, the logical, the kind resolution to your family's difficulty." He paused. "I would not want anything to complicate it, not for your mother's sake, not for Clara's, and not," a final pause, the fast word placed with the deliberateness of a man who saves the most important sentence for last, "for yours." He opened the front door himself, which was not correct socially, and which he did not care about, because this was not a social moment, and he went down the steps with his hat and gloves, and did not look back. Helen stood in the entrance hall. She stood there for 30 seconds, alone, breathing. Victor Hale had just made himself very clear. He was not simply positioning for Clara. He was positioned over the Vale family in a way that gave him the ability to make the difficult situation considerably worse. And he knew it, and he wanted Helen to know it. Because Helen was the person in this family who understood the finances, and therefore the person whose compliance mattered. He was threatening her specifically because she was the one who could actually assess the threat. She put her hand on the doorframe, just briefly steadying. Then she took her hand away and went back toward the drawing room. Henry stayed for luncheon. This was, Helen gathered from her mother's expression when he accepted, not something that had been planned for, but was being received as the best possible development. Mrs. Draper was alerted via Bess via Lady Nora in a rapid, quiet chain of instruction. The good cloth was extended. Another setting was produced, with a speed that suggested the household was capable of excellent work when sufficiently motivated. They sat at the dining table, all of them, and the luncheon was good, and the conversation was maintained at the pitch of an agreeable meal among people who are mostly comfortable with one another. And James was genuinely excellent company, and made Rose laugh twice in a way that seemed to surprise Rose herself. Clara managed the table with the ease of a woman in her element. Helen sat at her place and ate and spoke when spoken to, and did not speak when not spoken to, and was, by all measurable standards, exactly what Lady Nora had asked her to be: unremarkable, present, taking up no space. She was also, she could not help noticing, being watched. Not constantly, not conspicuously. But Henry, in the course of the meal, looked at her several times in the way that she had learned to identify as deliberate. He looked when she answered a question Lady Nora put to the table about the Ashford estate's history, because Helen had read about it somewhere, and answered with an accuracy that made Lady Nora blink. He looked when she quietly redirected a conversation that was beginning to make Rose visibly uncomfortable, doing it so smoothly that no one at the table noticed the redirection except the person being redirected and the person who had been watching her. He looked when she passed the bread to Clara without being asked, because Clara's hand had moved toward it and found it wasn't there, and Helen had already reached for it. He looked at the things she did that were not for looking at. This was the specific quality of his attention that Helen found most disorienting. He was not watching her perform. He was watching her exist, and finding something in the existing that merited continued watching, and doing it with the calm, methodical attention of a man taking inventory of something he wants to understand accurately. She did not know what to do with this. She passed the bread and adjusted Rose's conversation and answered Lady Nora's question and thought, underneath all of it, about Victor in the entrance hall, about the timeline, about 6 weeks, about the fact that whatever was happening in this dining room, and she was still not certain what it was happening inside a situation that had walls and a ceiling and a floor, and the floor was made of her family's debt, and the ceiling was made of what society decided she was, and the walls were made of Clara's need and Victor's influence. And Henry Grey, watching her pass bread at a luncheon table, was on one side of all those walls, and she was on the other. He found her afterward. The luncheon had concluded, and the party had moved back toward the drawing room for the conventional closing portion of the visit, and Helen had taken the opportunity of the movement to slip toward the back of the house on the pretext of a word with Mrs. Draper about the tray, which was a real pretext. She genuinely needed a word with Mrs. Draper, but also not entirely a pretext. She was in the corridor between the dining room and the kitchen when she heard a step behind her. She turned. Henry was in the corridor. He had not followed her with stealth, or with any particular air of having arranged this, but with the directness was simply his way of moving through situations, and he stopped at a distance that was correct and looked at her. "You are avoiding the drawing room," he said. "I have a question about the tray," Helen said. "Yes," he said. "And also you are avoiding the drawing room." She looked at him. She felt the absurd, inconvenient impulse to smile. She did not smile. "Lord Victor spoke to you," Henry said. It was not a question. The directness of it, the accuracy, startled her. "In the entrance hall," she said, after a moment. "I thought so." He held her gaze without the pressure of someone demanding a response, simply with the steadiness of someone who is present and waiting if she chooses to speak. Helen made a decision. She was not entirely certain it was a wise decision, but she was tired, in the way she had identified last week, and she was tired, specifically, of managing things alone in the back bedroom, with the accounts and the correspondence, and no one to carry any part of it with her. "He has influence over our financial circumstances," she said. "He made sure I understood that today. Henry was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man without something to say. The quiet of a man deciding what is most true to say first. "I know about your family's circumstances," he said. "I asked James for an accurate account. The timeline, the debt, the dependency on a match." Helen felt heat move into her face, not from embarrassment exactly. From the particular exposed feeling of having the facts of your life named by someone you have known for 4 days. "Then you know," she said carefully, "that this situation is not simple." "No," he agreed. "It is not simple." He held her gaze. "But I want you to know something, Miss Vale, and I want you to hear it accurately, not through the version your mother tells, and not through the version Victor Hale tells." He paused. "I came to this house on Tuesday because of an acquaintance I find worthwhile. I came today for the same reason. And the acquaintance is not the one your family has assumed." The corridor was very quiet. Helen looked at him. She looked at him with the full, direct attention she had been trained, all her life, to aim at household accounts and problems requiring solutions, and she brought it to bear on his face, which was steady and without performance. And she found no evidence of anything other than what he was saying. She said very quietly, "That is a complicated thing to have said." "Yes," he agreed, "I know." From the drawing room she could hear Clara's voice, bright and social, carrying pleasantly through the house. She could hear Lord James responding. She could hear the ordinary sounds of an afternoon visit concluding as it should. She was standing in a corridor with the Duke of Blackmoor, and he had just told her in plain language that he had come back to this house for her, and she had no framework for this, no column in the accounts where it could be entered, no category it fit into, no way to manage it with the methodical honesty she brought to everything else. "I should speak to Mrs. Draper," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he inclined his head, correctly and without awkwardness, and turned back toward the drawing room, and Helen stood in the corridor alone, with the sound of her own heartbeat, which was considerably louder than the situation warranted, and the knowledge that something had just changed in a direction she had not predicted and could not unknow. She pressed her hands flat against the sides of her skirt. She went to find Mrs. Draper. She was going to need, she thought, a very clear. Helen did not tell anyone what Henry had said. She carried it through Thursday evening and into Friday morning, the way you carry something fragile. Through a crowded room with both hands, with attention, without letting it show in your face. She sat at dinner Thursday night and passed dishes and answered questions and listened to Lady Nora conduct a quiet, precise post-mortem of the visit across the table, while Clara performed the composure of a woman who has not been unsettled, and Rose watched Clara to calibrate her own response, and the whole apparatus of the Vale family evening turned on its familiar axis. And Helen sat inside all of it with the corridor in her chest and said nothing. Friday morning, she was at the desk by 6. She opened the accounts and looked at the numbers, and the numbers were the same numbers they had been on Wednesday and on Tuesday and on every morning before that, when she had sat in this chair and looked at them. 6 weeks, perhaps 8. The arithmetic did not change because a man had said something in a corridor. The debt did not reduce. The timeline did not extend. Victor Hale's influence did not diminish. She wrote these facts in the margin of the accounts page in small, neat letters, not because she needed to record them, but because writing things down was how she tested whether they were real. The facts remained real, and alongside them also real, also resistant to doubt. I came back to this house for her. She sat with both sets of facts and felt the specific difficulty of a situation in which two true things exist in direct opposition to each other. She had managed the household accounts for 4 years. She understood that when two columns do not reconcile, one of them contains an error. She looked at both columns and could not find the error and understood, with the methodical clarity she brought to problems, she could not solve. Quickly, that this was not going to resolve in a morning. Downstairs the household began. Mrs. Draper and her pots, Bess and her perpetual slight lateness. The sounds of an ordinary Friday, arriving whether or not the people inside the house were ready for it. Helen closed the accounts. She opened them again. She closed them again. She went downstairs to begin the day. Lady Nora requested Helen in the parlor at 9. Not the drawing room, the parlor, which was a smaller and less arranged room at the back of the house. The room where the family went when what was needed was a conversation rather than a presentation. Helen came in and found her mother seated at the small table with the household correspondence in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, which was the posture of a woman who has arranged her thoughts in advance and is now ready to deliver them. Helen sat down across from her. "The Duke called twice in 1 week," Lady Nora said. "Yes," Helen said. "He stayed for luncheon. Yes. He spoke to you, not only to Clara. To you specifically, in front of the room." Helen said nothing. Lady Nora looked at her with the direct, assessing attention that she directed at problems she needed to solve accurately. It was, Helen had always thought, the quality they most shared, this particular kind of looking. The willingness to see a thing clearly, even when the seeing was uncomfortable. "I need to understand what's happening," Lady Nora said. Helen considered her answer. She considered what was accurate, what was owed, what was useful. "I believe the Duke is interested in forming a further acquaintance," she said. "With you." Helen met her mother's gaze. "He has not said so in explicit terms. He called you an acquaintance he finds worthwhile," Lady Nora said. "He redirected his attention to you in front of Victor Hale and Clara and myself, and did not appear to find this uncomfortable. He spoke to you in the corridor after luncheon." A pause. "I am not a woman who misreads rooms, Helen." "No," Helen agreed. "You are not." The silence between them had weight. Lady Nora looked at her folded hands and then back at Helen, and the look contained things that Helen rarely saw in her mother's face, or that her mother rarely permitted to be visible. Complexity, something close to pain. The specific pain of a woman who has managed an impossible situation for a very long time and has just discovered that the piece she thought was fixed has moved. "Clara needs a match," Lady Nora said. "I know. We have 6 weeks, perhaps less, depending on Finch's next letter. I know that too. Victor Hale is a reliable prospect. He is not what I would have chosen for Clara in a world with more choices available, but he is what is available. And his interest in Clara is genuine, or near enough to genuine to serve the same purpose." Lady Nora's voice was even, precise, the voice she used for facts. "If the Duke's attention to you disrupts Victor's interest in Clara, we lose the reliable prospect without gaining the better one." "Because you are not," she stopped. She chose the next words with care. "Because your circumstances and his are not ones that the world will facilitate easily." Helen looked at her mother. She heard the full sentence, including the part that had not been said, which was, "Because you are not Clara. Because you are not the one the world looks at. Because a duke does not cross the distance between his world and yours, without consequences neither of you can fully manage." "I understand the risk," Helen said. "Do you?" Lady Nora said, and it was not a question. Helen looked at the table, at the household correspondence stacked neatly under her mother's folded hands, at the letters she herself had written, disguised as her mother's words, managing and deferring and buying time with careful syntax. She looked up. "I have not sought his attention," she said. "I have not encouraged it. I have been exactly what you asked me to be at every event this season and in every room in this house." She held her mother's gaze and kept her voice even. "What I cannot do is be responsible for where he chooses to look." Lady Nora studied her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "No, that is fair." It was the most unexpected thing her mother had said to her in years. Helen sat with it and felt its weight, which was considerable. "But I need you to be careful," Lady Nora said. Whatever this is or is not, I need you to be careful, for all of us. Yes, Helen said. Lady Nora unfolded her hands and picked up the correspondence, and the conversation ended the way the Tuesday conversation had ended, and the one that if without resolution, because resolution was not yet available, and they were both, under everything, women who understood that you continued managing until the answer arrived. He left at 5. Lady Nora appeared on the stairs at 4:10, alerted by some maternal frequency that the house contained a situation, and she came into the parlor. And she managed it with the steady, composed excellence of a woman who has not slept properly in a week and is running. On principle alone, she greeted Henry correctly. She accepted the conversation at its face value. She made no reference to Clara or to Victor or to any of the machinery of the season, and she served the remaining tea with a gracious simplicity that was, Helen thought, one of the most controlled performances of her mother's very controlled life. Henry stayed another 40 minutes. He spoke with Lady Nora about the Ashford estate improvements, and about a charitable foundation that Lord Ashford was organizing, and about the weather, which had been the kind of December that made one grateful for fires, and he was excellent. Composed and genuine, and entirely comfortable in a room that contained approximately 17 layers of complication. And at 5 o'clock he rose and thanked Lady Nora, and looked at Helen once with the direct, unperformed attention that was his, and he left. Bess closed the door. The house was quiet. Lady Nora stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and then she turned and looked at Helen with an expression that Helen had never seen on her mother's face in 22 years, which was an expression of someone who has spent a long time being certain about the shape of the future, and has just been required to revise it completely, and is finding the revision not entirely terrible. He is going to come back, Lady Nora said. Yes, Helen said. And he is not coming back for Clara. No. Lady Nora pressed her lips together. She looked at the parlor door. She looked at the ceiling, briefly, in the way of a woman conducting an internal reckoning. Then she looked at Helen. What do you need? She said. It was the first time in Helen's memory that her mother had asked her that. Not what does the house need? Not what does the situation require? Not what does Clara need, or the season need, or the finances need? What do you need? Helen stood in the entrance hall of the Vale house on Weston Street, and felt the question land in the place where questions that matter land. And she thought about the accounts and the 6 weeks and Victor's letters and Clara upstairs and Rose on the smaller settee and all of it, the entire weight of the household she had been carrying without being asked and without being thanked. And she thought about a man who had come back at 3 o'clock on a Saturday without a note because he wanted to speak to her specifically. She thought about what she needed. She thought about what she had never, not once, allowed herself to say. I need, she said slowly, to be allowed to find out if this is real. Lady Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then find out, she said. The words were quiet, and they were not effusive, and they did not contain an apology, because Lady Nora was not a woman who apologized easily, and both of them knew it. But they were real. They were present and direct, and they were offered without calculation, which was, from Lady Nora, the closest thing to grace that Helen had ever received. She nodded. She went upstairs. She went past Clara's closed door, and she stood outside it for a moment, and she put her hand flat against the wood, and she stood there for 3 breaths, and then she went to the back bedroom and sat at the writing desk and did not open the accounts. She sat in the quiet and let herself, without management and without performance and without the arrangement of features that said nothing is wrong here, simply feel what she felt, which was frightened, which was alive, which was the particular raw, undefended quality of a person standing at the edge of something real, with no column in any account to put it in, and no letter she could write that would manage it into safety. She sat with it, outside the window, London was going into its winter dark, and somewhere across the city, she was fairly certain, a man with dark, careful eyes was sitting with something similar. She picked up her pen. She put it down. She sat in the dark and waited for morning. And for once in her life, she did not try to resolve the waiting into something useful. She simply let it be what it was. Lord James Hart arrived Friday afternoon without Henry. This was, Helen recognized from the moment Bess announced him, deliberate. James did not do things by accident. He accepted tea in the drawing room with the pleasant ease of a man who is comfortable everywhere, and he spoke with Lady Nora for 10 minutes about the upcoming Grenville party, and said charming things to Rose about a book she had mentioned at luncheon, and then, with the smooth social navigation of a man who has decided what he came to do, he arrived beside Helen near the window. "I have a message," he said quietly, with the directness that Henry had presumably cultivated in him by example. Not a literal one. He did not write a letter or ask me to deliver specific words, but I know him well enough to translate. Helen looked at him. "He is aware," James said, still quiet, still pleasant in his surface manner, "of the complexity of your situation. The family circumstances, Victor's position, your mother's requirements. He is not a man who acts without understanding consequences, his own or others." "What is the translation?" Helen said. James looked at the garden through the window, and his face in the winter light was thoughtful and without its usual easy amusement. "He does not want you to feel that you must manage this alone," he said. "Whatever you decide, however you proceed, he wants you to know that he is not going to create a situation and then disappear from it and leave you to resolve the damage." Helen was quiet. "That is the translation," James said. She looked at the garden for a moment, at the bare December trees, and the gray sky, and the familiar geometry of the small town garden that she had looked at from this window for years. "He barely knows me," she said. "He knows enough," James said. "Henry is not a man who decides things quickly or lightly. But when he has decided something, he has decided it." He paused. "I have known him for 11 years. I have seen him avoid drawing rooms and social obligations, and positioned young ladies with the patient ingenuity of a man who genuinely believes there is no version of this world that suits him." He looked at her. "He has not avoided this drawing room." Helen said nothing for a moment. She was thinking with the careful, double-checking thoroughness she brought to figures that needed to be accurate. "Lord James," she said, "what does he want me to do?" James's expression moved into something that was genuinely, quietly warm. "He wants you to do whatever you would do if Victor Hale had no leverage, and your mother had no requirements, and your family had no debts. He wants to know what you would choose if you were actually free to choose it." Helen looked at him. "Which is," James continued, with the honesty of a man delivering a message completely, "an absurd and impractical thing to want to know, given the actual circumstances. He knows that, but he still wants to know it." Helen turned back to the window. She thought about freedom as a category, a real one rather than theoretical, and found it, as she always found it, almost impossible to separate from the conditions of her actual life. "Tell him," she said slowly, "that I would like to answer that question. I am not yet certain of the answer, but I would like the chance to find it." James nodded, once, with the satisfied gravity of a man who has completed a task he cares about. "I will tell him," he said. The second letter arrived Saturday morning. It was longer than the first and more direct, by Victor's standards, which still meant it required reading carefully to extract the actual content from the surrounding pleasantry. Helen did not read this one by accident. Lady Nora brought it to the parlor table and sat down and said, "Read this," and handed it across without further framing. Helen read it. The first 2 paragraphs were an elaboration of Victor's interest in Clara, rendered in the most formal and flattering terms, with references to her character and accomplishments that were generous enough to be impossible to object to. The third paragraph noted, with the delicate precision of a surgeon, that the Duke of Blackmoor had a long-established reputation for social caution, that his previous season's behavior had included several apparent interests that had not resolved into anything formal, and that ladies and families who had oriented expectations around those interests had found themselves in difficult positions when the season concluded. The implication was clear, careful, and untrue enough to be unprovable. The fourth paragraph was the most direct Victor had ever been in writing, which meant it was the most frightened he had ever been. It stated that Victor wished to formalize his interest in Clara before the end of the month, that he was prepared to approach Lady Nora for the relevant conversation, and that he hoped the household would be in a position to receive that conversation without complication. Without complication meant without Helen. Helen set the letter down. Lady Nora was watching her. He is threatening to withdraw if the situation with the Duke continues. Yes, Helen said. And he is implying that the Duke's interest will not lead anywhere in order to make his own offer appear more reliable by comparison. Yes, Helen said. Is he right? Lady Nora said. About the Duke's history. Helen thought about the balcony. She thought about the corridor. She thought about James Hart sitting by the window yesterday afternoon with the translated message of a man who does not do things lightly. No, she said. I do not believe he is right. Lady Nora sat with this for a moment. Then, what are you prepared to do? It was a different question from the one Lady Nora had asked in this room before. Not what will you sacrifice? Not what will you manage? What are you prepared to do? The agency was different. The direction of it was different. Helen looked at the letter on the table. I need 2 weeks, she said. Give Victor a courteous response that neither accepts nor declines. 2 weeks. If nothing has clarified in 2 weeks, I will step back entirely, and Victor will have no further reason for concern. Lady Nora studied her with the long, measuring attention of a woman who has spent 20 years managing impossible situations and knows when someone else is capable of managing one. 2 weeks, Lady Nora said. Yes, a pause. You understand, Lady Nora said very quietly, that I have not protected you well this season, or before it. Helen looked at her mother's face, at the architecture she knew so thoroughly, and the thing moving across it that she had seen only once before, briefly, after Mr. Finch's first letter arrived. I know, Helen said. I am telling you, Lady Nora said, because it is true, not because it changes what we need, but because it is true. Helen heard Clara's words from the back bedroom returned in her mother's voice, from a different face, with a different history behind it, and understood that something was happening in this family that had not happened before, a slow and imperfect and costly turning towards something that resembled honesty. 2 weeks, Lady Nora said finally. Thank you, Helen said. He did not send a note. He did not arrange the call through Lord James or signal his intention through the usual channels. He arrived at the Vale house on Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock with no one beside him and knocked once and waited. Bess opened the door and then came to find Helen because Lady Nora was resting and Clara was upstairs and Helen was in the parlor with the household, accounts in the task of reading a careful, non-committal reply to Victor Hale that managed his expectations without provoking him. The Duke of Blackmoor is at the door, Bess said, with the expression of someone reporting a weather event that exceeds the available vocabulary. Helen set down her pen. She went to the door herself. He was standing on the step in the December cold, his coat dark against the gray afternoon, without James, without hat in hand, simply present in the way that was characteristic of him, without particular performance of the waiting. He looked at her when the door opened. Miss Vale, he said. Your Grace, she said. Lady Nora is resting. Clara is upstairs. I know, he said. I did not come at 3 o'clock on a Saturday without a note by accident. She looked at him for a moment. She felt the absurd impulse to smile again. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. She took him to the parlor, which was the only room available that was not the drawing room, with its arranged chairs and good china, and the whole apparatus of a formal visit. The parlor had the household accounts on the table, and the letter to Victor half drafted, and the remains of a cup of tea she had made herself at 2, and she gathered these up with a composed efficiency that did not quite conceal that the room looked lived in rather than presented. Henry looked around the parlor with the interested, non-judgmental attention he brought to everything, and sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him. "I spoke with James," he said. "I know," she said. "He told me your answer." "I know that too," she said. A pause, the kind that was not uncomfortable, the kind she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of conversations with him, where silence was not a gap to be filled, but a space in which things could be said carefully. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "About my intentions. Not in the formal sense, not yet, because I am not going to move faster than is fair to you or to the situation, but in the personal sense." Helen folded her hands in her lap and listened. "I have been in rooms like these for years," he said. "Ballrooms and drawing rooms and dinner tables, and I have been attentive and courteous and entirely elsewhere in all of them. I attend because it is required, and I leave when it is acceptable. And in 11 years, not one of those rooms has given me a single moment of the feeling I had on that balcony." Helen was very still. "Which was the feeling," he said, "that the person in front of me was real, completely real, not performing and not managing and not arranging herself for my benefit." He held her gaze. "You were frightened of Victor and furious about it, and you were holding the railing and trying not to let either thing show, and you were almost succeeding. And I found that more interesting than anything a ballroom had offered me in a decade." Helen looked at him. She looked at him with the full honesty she had been trying to locate for 4 days, the honesty that did not deflect and did not manage and did not perform composure over whatever was underneath the composure. "I am not always like that," she said. "No one is always like anything," he said. "That is not what I mean." A pause. "I mean that you are someone who is genuinely there. And I have been in rooms full of people who are not genuinely there for a very long time." Helen pressed her hands flat on her knees. She thought about the accounts on the table, and Victor's letter, and the 6 weeks, and everything that was true and structural and resistant to feeling. "My situation is complicated," she said. "Yes," he said. "My family needs a resolution this season that does not depend on uncertain prospects." "I know," he said. James was thorough. "Victor Hale has influence over our financial circumstances that makes ignoring him genuinely dangerous." "I know that too," he said. "And I intend to address it." She looked at him sharply. "How?" "By making certain," he said with the quiet final quality of a man stating a fact, "that his leverage does not remain leverage. That is not something that happens this afternoon, but it is something that happens." Helen studied his face. She was looking for the performance, for the social construction, for the thing underneath the words that was different from the words. She did not find it. She found the same thing she had found on the balcony and in the corridor, a man who said what he meant and meant it precisely as stated. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her with the dark, careful eyes that she had been cataloging for a week. "Because safe enough," he said quietly, "is not the same thing as safe, and I find I am no longer content to know that you are not safe and do nothing about it." The parlor was very quiet. The accounts were on the table, and the letter to Victor was half written, and the December light was going gray in the dark window, and Helen Vale sat across from the Duke of Blackmoor, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific, terrifying, entirely real sensation of being seen. Not the arranged version, not the invisible version, not the woman with the mended gloves and the blank dance card and the careful features. The actual one. She breathed in. "I would like," she said, carefully and honestly, "to believe you." "Yes," he said, "I know. I am going to make it easier to. It could not hold, and it did not. Clara came downstairs at 3:30 and found the parlor occupied, and the occupation of it registered on her face in real time, the sequence of understanding moving across her features in the order it arrived. Henry Gray, Helen, the parlor table, the domestic, unperformed intimacy of the scene, which was more legible and more damaging than any formal visit in the drawing room. She stood in the doorway. Henry rose. He rose with the courtesy that was simply his instinct, and he said, "Miss Clara," with the pleasant neutrality of a man who is not going to pretend that the situation is other than what it is, but is also not going to perform a confrontation. Clara said, "Your Grace," with a composure that cost her, visibly and significantly. Helen looked at her sister from her chair. She did not look away. She held Clara's gaze with the steadiness of someone who has moved past management into something more honest and is not going to retreat from it. And the steadiness said, "I know what this is. I know what it costs you. I am not going to lie to you about it." Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Henry. Then she turned and went back upstairs with the measured step of a woman who is not going to cry where anyone can see her. And the deliberateness of it, the dignity of it, was the most Clara-like thing Helen had ever seen. And also, in some complicated way, she did not have time to examine the most human. Henry sat back down. "She is in pain," Helen said. "Yes," he said, "I know. This is going to damage her season, whatever else it is." "I know that too," he said. He held her gaze. "I am sorry for it. I am genuinely sorry for the cost of it. But I am not sorry." He stopped. He chose the next words with the care of someone who believes in accuracy. "I am not able to be sorry for the specific thing." Helen understood what he was not able to be sorry for. She sat with it and thought about her sister upstairs and her mother resting, and Rose, who was young and frightened and following the loudest voice available to her. And she thought about the family she had been managing and protecting and absorbing damage for. And she thought about what it meant, that for once one thing in this house was hers, just hers, not useful to anyone else, not a resource to be allocated, just hers. She did not know yet what to do with it, but she was not going to give it back. He left at 5. Lady Nora appeared on the stairs at 4:10, alerted by some maternal frequency that the house contained a situation, and she came into the parlor. And she managed it with the steady, composed excellence of a woman who has not slept properly in a week and is running on principle alone. She greeted Henry correctly. She accepted the conversation at its face value. She made no reference to Clara or to Victor or to any of the machinery of the season, and she served the remaining tea with a gracious simplicity that was, Helen thought, one of the most controlled performances of her mother's very controlled life. Henry stayed another 40 minutes. He spoke with Lady Nora about the Ashford estate improvements, and about a charitable foundation that Lord Ashford was organizing, and about the weather, which had been the kind of December that made one grateful for fires, and he was excellent. Composed and genuine, and entirely comfortable in a room that contained approximately 17 layers of complication. And at 5 o'clock, he rose and thanked Lady Nora, and looked at Helen once with the direct, unperformed attention that was his, and he left. Bess closed the door. The house was quiet. Lady Nora stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and then she turned and looked at Helen with an expression that Helen had never seen on her mother's face in 22 years, which was an expression of someone who has spent a long time being certain about the shape of the future, and has just been required to revise it completely, and is finding the revision not entirely terrible. "He is going to come back," Lady Nora said. "Yes," Helen said. "And he is not coming back for Clara." "No." Lady Nora pressed her lips together. She looked at the parlor door. She looked at the ceiling, briefly, in the way of a woman conducting an internal reckoning. Then she looked at Helen. "What do you need?" she said. It was the first time in Helen's memory that her mother had asked her that. Not what does the house need. Not what does the situation require. Not what does Clara need, or the season need, or the finances need. What do you need? Helen stood in the entrance hall of the Vale house on Weston Street and felt the question land in the place where questions that matter land. And she thought about the accounts and the 6 weeks and Victor's letters and Clara upstairs and Rose on the smaller settee and all of it, the entire weight of the household she had been carrying without being asked and without being thanked. And she thought about a man who had come back at 3 o'clock on a Saturday without a note because he wanted to speak to her specifically. She thought about what she needed. She thought about what she had never, not once, allowed herself to say. I need, she said slowly, to be allowed to find out if this is real. Lady Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then find out, she said. The words were quiet, and they were not effusive, and they did not contain an apology, because Lady Nora was not a woman who apologized easily, and both of them knew it. But they were real. They were present and direct, and they were offered without calculation, which was, from Lady Nora, the closest thing to grace that Helen had ever received. She nodded. She went upstairs. She went past Clara's closed door, and she stood outside it for a moment, and she put her hand flat against the wood, and she stood there for 3 breaths, and then she went to the back bedroom and sat at the writing desk and did not open the accounts. She sat in the quiet and let herself, without management and without performance and without the arrangement of features that said nothing is wrong here, simply feel what she felt, which was frightened, which was alive, which was the particular raw, undefended quality of a person standing at the edge of something real, with no column in any account to put it in, and no letter she could write that would manage it into safety. She sat with it. Outside the window, London was going into its winter dark, and somewhere across the city, she was fairly certain, a man with dark, careful eyes was sitting with something similar. She picked up her pen. She put it down. She sat in the dark and waited for morning. And for once in her life, she did not try to resolve the waiting into something useful. She simply let it be what it was.